Okay. So welcome to ARM 55. This is the first class that we will be hosting tonight. And so we'll be going over Chapter 1 as well as going over introductory information as part of the class. Tonight's class will be may go a little bit longer than the normal. Typically the classes will go about 90 minutes because of the intro information, and that this is a little bit of a lengthy chapter. We might just spend just a little bit more time than the 90 minutes, but not too much more. Again, the sponsors that we've had, a lot of groups sponsor either their employees or their organizations as part of this. Obviously, the University of California, the Office of Risk Services. We have ERM University, which we are sponsoring for all UC employees. The Golden Gate RIMS chapter, Risk and Insurance Management Society, as well as Alaska RIMS. Actually not listed there, Sacramento RIMS. Alliant Insurance Services, as well as Bickmore Risk Services. And I know there's also a study group that Los Angeles Unified School District is also set up out there. As well as ASSE members. I'm on the board of directors for ASSE, and so we've also made this available for ASSE members as part of that. Just kind of get an idea, even though we're not going to go through all the introductions of everyone, a little bit about me, my background. My name is E. Reich Young. I am the Director of Environment, Health, and Safety, and also now the Deputy Director for Enterprise Risk Management for the University of California. I've been teaching the class in the various, well, this is the new textbook, but I've taught the class for the last 5 years using the old textbook, and really did the ARM 54, the whole series, as well as ARM 57. And because of all the textbook changes, now it's time to redo them. Otherwise, I pretty much, if the textbook doesn't change and the exam doesn't change, once the class is done, I pretty much just let it go, because just like with math, 2 plus 2 is always going to be 4. The material in the test, if it doesn't change, it's going to be the same material. Just maybe the examples may change to try to make that more relevant. We do have approximately, at least, well, actually, we're up to 170 students now in the class. Most of them are higher education, mostly obviously from UC, the California State University system. We have quite a few people from the hospital areas, as well state and local government, risk pools, insurance, consulting, and even some in the real estate area. Most, again, are in California. And again, to give you some context, we pretty much have everyone from Alaska to Maine. And as well as we do have a couple foreign participants, the same as last time, both from Denmark and Morocco. So we do have some foreign participation as well. So we do have a quick question before we, looks like an audio issue, just make sure. Not able to hear it before 5:30. Okay. And unfortunately, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to help on that one, Amanda. So if you, on the audio, you may want to, for those that have trouble, you may want to try to call in using the phone line rather than doing the computer version. So the course schedule, this is also sent out in the email that was sent out earlier. But for those that are online, this is kind of, if you want to look at it from week 1, week 2, this is the information we'll be trying to cover. Essentially, this is during the next 12 weeks, with 2 weeks with no class occurring due to travel schedule on my part. Sometimes it's a little tough to do a class in a hotel room, so we try to keep those here. So obviously tonight, Chapter 1. Next week, Chapter 2 and 3, so a little bit more reading for folks. But then typically we'll only cover 1 chapter a night. We'll be able to get caught up for those around the end of August, and then another break right near the end of the course. We do, it is 11 chapters. The last class was basically a course review, kind of cover some of the highlights of those areas that most likely will be on the exam that you'll probably see. The other thing I guess I would add on here is we'll be going over study information and how to get the most use out of that information here. Someone put their hand down. So on the recording, so for those that are either attending the class live now or be listening to the recordings later, all the material basically I try to get up within 24 hours, and to be honest with you, it's usually up within the hour after the class is done. Most people, last time I was able to get that information up fairly quickly. And Catherine, your hand is up. I'm going to go ahead and unmute your line if you have a question. Catherine, can you hear me? Okay. And most likely, some people, unfortunately, probably pressed the hand raising button accidentally since I couldn't hear Catherine. And some, so we'll have all the recordings there. They're going to be on the YouTube channel. I have a secure YouTube channel. Everything will be on at the armstudygroup.com website. So I set up a Dropbox right now, but over the weekend what I'll be doing is adding everyone. It's more of a subscription service, so it's secure. And that way the only people that can access the material are those that are actually registered for the course, and you'll have a login information that goes with that. For those that do travel or may not be able to have access to YouTube since there's blocks on some computers, if that is the case, let me know, and then I will provide you access to the recordings. But please keep in mind those recordings are 60 to 70 megabytes. They're quite large files. It takes a while to download. But the good news is that while you're on an airplane or other areas, without internet access, you can actually, take them with you and listen to those. This always becomes the topic of scheduling the exam. So we're slated to end near basically, right beginning of October, into September, right in that area. So right now the block to register for here, or the testing window, they kind of have a certain testing window in there. And so if you go online to the Institute, you can, I'm trying to think, I didn't put the testing window specifically on this one, but through September 15th is actually the end date. So most likely you want to do the next testing window. They don't have that one shown up on the website yet there. And so when you register, you'll go on there. For those that are UCOP or near here, we're actually a registered testing site, and so the registration fee is only $165 to take the exam, and you can take that here. Otherwise, you have to go through the Promedics Testing Center. If there's others in the area that are not UC employees that want to test at the OP facility, we can certainly arrange that. You just need to email me, and we'll make sure that that happens. And then as far as it's a kind of step-by-step process, I can walk you through the process here. As far as the exam itself, it's a 85-question multiple choice exam, and we'll be going more over the exam probably during the review of exactly what to expect, the type of questions. The good news is that the passing ratio, actually this is, if you want to call it the easiest of the series of the three exams, this is actually has the highest passing ratio of about 80%. ARM54 is around 70%. So it's a little bit more challenging of an exam with that. So how to make the most of the review as we go through this. And again, this is review for those that have done the last session. Obviously mute your phones. I kind of do that for you. Take notes if you have a course guide. Obviously writing, trying to copy all the information on the slides. You're going to receive all the information so you can print out, or you can make notes on the slides, however you want to do that. It makes it easiest for you. Obviously, we want to try to get questions as best we can, but sometimes just with the amount of material, we may have to go through it. And then, but by all means, near the end, if nothing else, I'll stay online and be able to answer those, as well as try to get those questions out to others if the information most likely would benefit everyone else. Again, the goal is to cover all all the chapters in 10 weeks. So we average one chapter per meeting, but there's at least 2 weeks where we're going to have at least 2 chapters, and then we try to take try to look at which ones are the smaller ones, the bite size we might be able to take and do that. Again, the primary purpose of this exam is really to pass the national exam. Now, it's also just good information for those that may not want to take the exam. That's fine. I think it's good information to have, but we also want to do that. So a question did come up for those that someone said that they took the old 54 exam, if they need to retake the new one. The good news, no, you don't. So anyone that took an old exam, even if it was 10 years ago, that is part of the series, the institutes keep the records of that, and so you just need to do the next 2 in the series. So even though the information is pretty much completely changed from the old exam, it's still, they still say that it's valid as far as they're concerned. Another question we do have, I'm with UCOP group, but not in the career field. About broad understanding, there's no requirement to take the exam. Correct. Absolutely. So again, for those that are not interested, and taking the exam. This is also, I believe, it's good information to have. So, and I think you'll see the benefit of it as we go through this course. All right. So, studying the material. Typically, one of the things I recommend, or people always ask, well, how much studying during this, is it going to take? I would say, on average, it's probably about 5 hours per chapter that most people probably spend. Some, a little more, a little less, but it's probably on average. So, with 11 chapters, 55, get some extra studying time. So, you're probably looking at 60 hours during the next 10 weeks here. And again, that's assuming you're studying to pass the exam as part of that. In addition to the 90 minutes of the online, I would say it's probably you're going to spend at least an hour reading the text. It's about 30 pages, and as you go through. But I recommend when people do go through and read the textbook before the class, I'd read the chapter, which we're going to cover. First, read the educational objectives, get an idea there. Then, before you read the rest of the text, read the summary at the very end of the chapter. Okay. The reason why I say that is pretty much anything that it talks about what you should know, and then what's at the summary at the end is going to give you a good idea of what to expect, what's important. If it's repeated kind of twice in there, you're going to get a good idea of what you probably want to focus on. And then you read the text and you have a better idea. And then listen to the recording or attend the live session, and then I'd go back and take a look at, because I'll tell you areas or have the book open while we're going over the different areas of the chapters. Just kind of highlight it. They'll say, hey, this is most likely going to be on the exam, or make sure you know this, and that'll give you some ideas of what things you really want to study. And there's also some stuff that's kind of filler. It's interesting information, but again, from the purpose of the passing exam, what information do you really need to know to be able to do that? And again, some people always ask about the course guide, about having the questions. Do you need all those? I know most people actually pass the exam without having the additional material. Some people want it. You can certainly do that, but it's really not necessary. Most of the time, just doing this is sufficient. Some other, again, when you study all educational objectives, whatever's listed in the objectives in the beginning, that's kind of what they want you to know. That's what's important. The other thing to keep in mind when you look at that, and I think most people have agreed that have now taken the exam on the new one, is they're not asking you to memorize every single little detail about what date did this happen. It's really looking at a 50,000-foot level. What they want to know is, do you understand the concepts? If you understand the concepts, you should be able to answer, determine what the answers are without getting into nitty-gritty detail. And those that had passed the exams basically said that was pretty true. They didn't need to memorize a whole bunch of stuff. Now, having said that, there are some things that you do want to memorize, which are things in lists. Typically, a lot of things are in tables that are lists, and they say, and I put in here, the text has 4 pre-law schools and 6 law post schools, and so do you. Those are the things that you probably do want to memorize because they are more of a step-by-step. Now, if it's 20 things in a list, most likely they don't expect you to know that. But there's going to be it's a 5-step process, and it's in order. Know the 5-step process and order when you do that. And then the other thing we'll cover near the end when we do the review is the test questions. We'll have information. One question later on in the exam may provide clues to what the answer is in another question, but they don't necessarily build upon each other in there. So before we get started, we do have one hand that is raised. So Catherine, your hand's raised. I'm going to try to mute your line again. Catherine, can you hear me? Catherine? No. Okay. So, and then Luke, you had a question? You're on. Try to mute your line so we can hear you.
My experience with the exam, and I've taken it twice now, and not passed either time. Otherwise, I wouldn't be taking this. I've gone through the text exactly like you're talking about, and I just feel like there's kind of a disconnect between the subjects in the text, in each chapter of the text, and what the questions that are actually tested on. So when you talk about the test, are you going to cover that through the course of this your course kind of.
Yeah. So we don't get the background noise. So yeah, so part of what we'll be doing, and I think again the challenge is that it's getting the context of, and that's what I think people end up is that, you know, I think when those that listen to recordings, I'll give a lot of examples, and that makes it a lot easier to understand how we're going to move forward with it. So, and again, we got 10 weeks to go through this, and as people have questions, we'll certainly answer those. And I think, Luke, one of the things that we had talked before in the past, and with the new exam, you know, it's a little going to be different subject matter than probably the old exam as well. So with that, let's go and get started. So chapter 1 is going to be on introduction to risk assessment and treatment, which is just really going to be the general overview of what we're looking at. With each class, I basically do cover the educational objectives right at the very beginning. So for those that don't have the textbook, we can have an idea. So the learning objectives that we're going to be covering tonight: describe the nature of risk assessment and the risk assessment process, as well as describe the major risk identification and analysis techniques, describe risk treatment process and risk treatment techniques, and be able to describe accident analysis techniques. And so we're going to talk a little bit about, you know, domino theory, energy transfer theory, technique of operations or TOR, change analysis and job safety analysis. Describe a little bit of what those are. And again, you don't need to know, like with Hayden, there's what, 20 or 12 things. They're not, you know, it's more of an understanding which one of these theories are going to ask you to compare some of those things when we start going through them. Describe safety system and its primary purposes, and explain how to implement the following loss control techniques for hazard risk. And so we'll be talking about avoidance, loss prevention, loss reduction, separation, duplication, and diversification. So, overview of risk assessment. So when we look at it, you know, what is the definition that they provide in the book is, you know, risk assessment is a process that provides all levels of management with a picture of risks affecting the organization. And when you think about it, you know, when you assess something, you're trying to get an idea. When you're out in the field and you're just trying to get a snapshot of what the problems are. And that's really what you're looking at when you're doing the risk assessment, is just to kind of get oriented, what's going on with the organization. And really enables an organization to effectively manage aspects of risk and in the impact of meeting organizational objectives. So the idea being, once you assess the universe of what you're trying to look at, you want to put them in relation to what are the strategic objectives of the organization, what's the mission, and how does the operations doing the risk assessment affect those? What's inhibiting our ability to meet it, or what are the things we should leverage that will help us meet those objectives in there? Now, it also talks again, so this is review of what was kind of covered really in in ARM 54. When we look at the risk definition, it's really what's called the uncertainty about outcomes that can either be negative or positive. So, okay, so if you think about risk, when you go to, the best example of risk is going to Las Vegas, going to the, craps table or whatever, and you can have a positive outcome or you can have a negative outcome. And that's really what risk management is. It's all about probabilities and what's the, what can we look at. And so when we think about risk from an organizational standpoint, what's, a negative outcome can be an accident, can be a lawsuit, things like that. A positive outcome might be that we leveraged from a financial standpoint. For Southwest, we bought oil or jet fuel at a, locked in at a lower price. So that could be the positive aspect of risk. And then we think about risk management. It's the process of making and implementing decisions that enable an organization to optimize its level of risk. And again, a little different terms of most people, but optimize, when we talk about optimizing a level of risk, it's, it's not necessarily, we want to mitigate, but there's also ways, again, we can make things into a positive when we think about it moving forward there. I used the same slide that we used actually in 54 when we talked about some of the definition of risk management as part of the review. Actually, this is actually a good book, is Against the Gods, and it talks a little about, it's really the history of risk management, of how it all developed way back when in the Greek era, and all the way moving forward to Lloyd's of London and things like that. But it's actually, it's a very good read. But when you look at the definition, about optimizing risk, the idea is that, you can spend a lot of money on either what we call over-controlling or treating the risk, or sometimes you can under-control. And so some of the examples we used in the last class, maybe a good example might be, let's say, earthquakes, or for the risk is earthquakes. There's only so much you can do to a building, and you keep throwing dollars at it, and you're not going to reduce. You only mitigate. Your marginal rate of return starts declining at some point. Or maybe it's a building with sprinklers. Then you keep on adding more and more protection depending on what the asset is. You may be overprotecting. Most of the time, we're probably under controlling risks. That we're not doing enough, and usually that might be in the workers' comp area to help prevent injuries or things like that. Looks like we do have. Okay. So when we look at categories of risk, and again, this is more of review from what we saw from the first chapter or from the first series. We think of hazard risk, which is typically what most people think of when we think of risk management. Hazard risk are things that are really insurable, and or they might be called pure risks. An event can happen or cannot happen, right? So you're gonna have an injury or not have an injury, but there's no option for gain. So that's what we consider to be a speculative risk, which is something that when there can be a potential gain out of it. Whereas pure risk, it's either going to happen or not happen. And that's going to be workers' comp, liability, slip and falls, those type of things are typically, and those are the things that are most likely insurable risks. Operational risk is going to be a little different. So operational risk is it's people in some cases. Do we have the right equipment to be able to do the job? Those type of things that can inhibit the operations of an organization. If we have and it could also be personnel. Do we have the right people to be able to do the job, and things like that. Typically, financial risk is a little bit more straightforward. That's the monetary, that's credit risk. Those aspects, and the strategic risks are more related to how do we the organizational moving forward. Okay, good example of strategic risk for those in UC is the Regents. We have a new president today, or selected as a new president. Well, there's a strategic choice that was made, and they talked about that, of what they wanted. So there's a strategic decision made of having a non-academic, lead the university. And so that, whether they know that they're practicing enterprise risk management or risk management in that aspect, but those are the type of things that people certainly look at. And then when we talk about risk profiles, there's certain characteristics that are common to all risks in a profile. So if we said, depending on operation, a school district, there's certain risks that, with student risk there's associated, with, potential liability, with maybe sports athletics that are part of that. Actually, there's a case I just read this afternoon. It's more Little League, but parents are suing for $1 million because their son was struck during playing baseball and is now having neurological issues. But then there's transportation risk, so that's all part of the portfolio. So if you think of what your operations are, you see we have every single type of risk that's out there. But depending on your operations at one department, there might be a portfolio of risk that's specific to that one department. I'm going to go ahead and try it one more time. It looks like Catherine. Go ahead, because it looks like if we're not able to hear you on the line, if you go and type in your question, we'll be able to do it that way. All right? So the microphone's not working on that one. So go ahead and type in the question. We'll be able to answer it for you. In the book, they show this as well. So you have, the risk quadrants, and again, this is something similar that we saw in the last ARM 54. And so this kind of gives more definitions of what hazard risk, property, legal, operational, can be people, IT, management oversight. And then you kind of see the line that kind of talks about, pure risk is up on the top. This is insurable. These are things can happen or not happen. Whereas in the speculative type, strategic, there might be some gain. There can be opportunities to where we can actually make money or things like that. As we go through the, this textbook, we're going to be talking more about this, but there'll be a section on hazard risk specific to personnel risk. We'll be talking about reputational risk. How do you assess it? What are the things? How can you prevent having a loss from a reputational risk area can also be part of that. All right, go back to the pointer there. So when we think about the goals of what we're trying to do when we do a risk assessment, we use this term, a lot, risk assessment. We're going to need to do an assessment of that, and so we kind of just throw it out there quite a bit. But really what we're trying to do is we want inform management at all levels of the risks facing the organization and how those risks might affect the ability to meet those objectives. And that can happen at the highest level. Where they'll do a risk assessment. They'll ask, hey, what's the risk associated with, again, selecting a new president? What are the things we're looking for, the qualities? If we pick this person, what do we get? Again, for those that listen to to the hearing or to the discussion of the regent, there's a lot of discussion about well, immigration and all that, and they had to know going into that those questions were probably going to be asked of this person, and so there's an expectation of that, or at least if they did a risk assessment, they would know, hey, these are the type of things. Let's get ready for those type of questions as part of that. Yeah, go ahead.
They talked about her access to Washington as well, factored in her decision, which was
So some of the positive aspects from a risk assessment, let's look up. So we optimize risk. The possibility of having someone that's, if you want to call it a Washington insider, could certainly be a positive aspect of that as well. So when we do that, some of the goals when we do a risk assessment, we want to identify potential risk treatment options. And when we talk about risk treatment, of how are we going to control that? What are the things we're going to put in place? If we know this is an issue that people might have, we want to make sure we get enough information to kind of counter the argument that people may have on the immigration issue or things like that. So it's basically being prepared. It might be just information is how we treat a risk, whereas other things might be actual buying equipment. It just depends on what the area that we're dealing with. And so when we talk about risk assessment, we're really talking such a broad area because it depends on the risk that you're dealing with. Because if you're in the banking industry, you're going to deal with that type of risk. And so I want to try to keep this as broad as possible. When you think about it, these are general ideas, but they apply in almost all situations of how you do the risk assessment. So you want to consider both the existing and emerging risks. So when we think about existing, we know what those are when we do it, but what are emerging risks? Well, those are the things that we kind of see on the horizon, potential regulation, or for the healthcare industry, for the medical centers within the UC system, or for any hospital healthcare, the emerging risks that we know about is, of course, the Affordable Care Act. How is that going to affect? What are the things we're going to put in place? And what are the things we may not know about? Analyze the upside and downside of uncertainties of what we may know. And also, we want to evaluate the likelihood and consequences of what those things might happen. So we're all kind of doing that as part of risk assessment, as part of the process. At least that's the goal of it. And again, examples I kind of put out there is, think about when we look at things that may affect us in the future, technology is changing, privacy issues, the reality of how much information on Facebook, what are those things of how people, you look at the whole Snowden aspect of what happened. Sustainability. What are the things changing, not only in the U.S., but globally when it comes to sustainability? And a lot of times that might be new regulations, but a lot of things from a sustainability standpoint, people are doing because it makes good business sense to do it. It's not just because regulations require that. All right. And the other part of the risk assessment process, must be conducted with the understanding of risk appetite and risk tolerance of an organization. And so the definitions that are given in the book on risk appetite is total exposed, this kind of convoluted, is total exposed amount that an organization wishes to undertake on the basis of risk-return trade-offs for a desired outcome. And then the risk tolerance is the amount of uncertainty an organization is prepared to accept in total or within a certain business unit. So the example that Nancy Son with Bickmore always gives, which I like, is going to a buffet. Is when you think about it, you see all this food, and you might have a certain, what's your risk appetite? There's only a certain, how much do you want to undertake, for a certain outcome? If you just want to, you can take on a lot of risk. You're only this hungry, but you see all this food, and you may take on more risk, but unintentionally, and then you'll pay for it the next day. So that's the idea, is when you kind of think of the risk appetite. And the tolerance level is, kind of measuring. It's what that, how much are you willing to take on. You see all that, and you kind of set your own tolerance level of what you expect. And that, again, might be within the organization as a whole or within a unit, saying, we're willing to take on. It's another way to think about is, can you sleep at night? And again, the risk appetite is kind of risk-reward aspect, or another word. They kind of use a lot more words to describe that, is our risk appetite, we're willing to take how much risk, and we expect this much gain. But at the same time, at tolerance, they're going to say, but I want more insurance to help cover us just in case. And so that's where that tolerance and aspect kind of comes into play. When you do, as far as the different aspects of the risk assessment process, there's different tools and techniques. And again, they're going to vary. So the things they talk about in the textbook are questionnaires, checklists, cause and effect analysis, failure analysis. And then a lot of times they can be both qualitative and quantitative. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about some of these different techniques here in a moment. The other aspect is, top-down or bottom-up. Typically, the reality is you're going to have both go on when you do a risk assessment in some cases. It depends on what the goals are. But if you're doing a top-down, it's going to be more strategic. What are the aspects from a mission standpoint of where you want to go with that? And so they're looking globally at the organization. We're more of a bottom-up assessment, probably more line managers at a local level that are looking, or more of an office, like a department. They're going to look at which way they want to go to identify business level risk, and they're going to be more operational in nature. How do we become more efficient? How do we make sure that our employees don't get injured if they're working in this environment? Or it might be even looking at, if you're a fleet organization, what kind of routes, what kind of equipment are you going to purchase to make sure that it's appropriate? Does the equipment meet the new regulatory requirements? I'll give an example where, unfortunately, I'm on a school board, and we kind of risk assessments, I would say, probably weren't, it's not necessarily a normal thing that are done, and but this is what the downside of where the school district got caught is with AB 32, which is basically California carbon credit area. What the changes were that certain diesel engines, particulates can, you have to change the emission controls, and so we got caught with 3 buses that we can no longer drive because they don't meet regulations. And so now we have, now the district is looking at spending a whole bunch of money for 3 buses because we can't afford not to have them in operation. That's an example of, if you do a risk assessment, you can identify from an operational level, okay, what are the risks, look at the regulatory environment, what's going on, and it's a continuous process. It's not going to be say, okay, we do it, and then 5 years later we do another one, because you're going to miss different aspects when you do that. And when you do that, both, it talks about that, if you can, both approaches, you want to have them integrated as much as possible. So the other aspect is when we think as part of the risk assessment process, and they didn't actually include the graph, and I probably should have included it, because risk assessment within there's actually the broad areas that talks about identification and analysis. So when we talk about risk assessment, there's a couple steps. And so the first step is identification of the risk. And so when we do that, we're going to review all aspects of internal and external environment to identify events, as I put the quotes on, that could either improve or inhibit achieving organizational objectives. And so this is really, I talk about, it's a risk register. You want to take a look at your whole broad environment. You want to identify, if I'm trying to think of a different operation here, I'm using different examples, but if I'm operating a fleet that I do, long haul type of fleet operations. So I'm going to look at what are the risks of those operations. Again, the type of vehicles I might be using. I've got maintenance issues with air, EPA, maybe air quality requirements I have to meet depending on what states I'm going to operate in. Well, what about the driver qualifications? That's a risk I need to deal with. What type of material am I going to be hauling? Because then if I'm, the tractors, the trailers, maybe I need refrigerated trailers in some aspects. I mean, so there's all those things you need to put in, what are the risks associated, and you have to identify those. And so the idea is to make the list as long as you can of what are the potential risks, because then the next step is really kind of saying, okay, then you want to rank them and get an idea. Is there really, what are the concerns? So the idea is, involves a complete inventory of possible risks, and then to avoid consequences of identified risk. And what that means, to avoid the consequences of identified risk, there's so many things we do because we don't know what the risks are. All of a sudden, we get caught with our pants down, and that's kind of the idea. Is if you don't know what the risks are, it's going to hit you. You're going to get blindsided by it, and so that's why risk registry, as much as possible. That's why it's being encouraged a lot more to have something like that. And then once we have all the sources, risk sources and exposures, they need to be examined to determine potential financial consequences and controls to mitigate. So you take a look at that list and say, okay, if this is a risk, so let's slip and falls, if that's a risk that we identify based on our operations, well, what can we do to mitigate that? We can, buy slip-resistant shoes. We can change our type of flooring that we use. I mean, there's different mitigations. And then you look, again, what's the consequence of a slip and fall? Well, it's broken ankle, maybe broken hip. It can be nothing, but you kind of look at the likelihood of those. Now, for those, since we do have a lot of higher ed on there, I've included at the bottom on here, you see bulletins. I'm not going to show those here tonight, but basically, you see put together on our ERM program several bulletins that talks about the various risks that are unique to universities and has mitigation, what some of the mitigation efforts are, and those type of things. So it gives you an idea of some of the things that we've already thought about. It's not an exhaustive list by any means. It's more strategic. It's much at a higher level overall of operations, but it gives a context of what, as a university as a whole, what things we should be looking at and be concerned with. This next step, when we look at the risk identification process, is now we've identified all these things, we put this long list together, now it's the analysis piece of it. We kind of identified the potential likelihood and things. Now we want to investigate the identified risk to make decisions regarding risk treatment is needed and technique that's used. And so when we talk a little bit later about some of the different techniques, we can avoid a risk. We can just not do it. We say, something, it's too risky. So a good example is, do you want people do window washing? If you have a high-rise building, do you want to have your own maintenance people do window washing on a high-rise? Well, maybe not. It's kind of, it's a little special area. You probably want to contract out, and you want to really avoid that risk, and you let someone else take that on and let them do that because they're specialized. They have the right training. Hopefully they've done a risk assessment. They have a proper insurance if something goes wrong, and that way, you can relieve yourself of some of those areas. So when you do the risk analysis, you're going to consider the causes and sources of the risk. So we know, again, we said, here's the whole long list of risks, what potentially happen. Now we're going to kind of think of what the causes, what might actually cause that event to happen. Again, the positive and negative impacts and likelihood of those impacts. We might do a risk map or matrix. Basically, what we're talking about when we do risk analysis, if you want to think of the context, it's prioritization. What you're trying to do is now you take this long list and you're trying to see analysis, which one's going to rise to the top, that's the ones that I need to take care of first. Now, where this is a little different than most people, when we look at, and this is where the ERM process, and for those that haven't taken 54, which kind of, I guess the challenge is when we think about risk, there's reputational risk that we have to think of, there's compliance risk, financial, and so when we do the risk analysis, it's actually taking all those into consideration. A lot of times for those that are in risk, safety and health, we just look at the hazard, the hazard risk, or a lot of times we just look at compliance, and we don't think about those other areas of saying, which things, just because we have to be compliant, they're still more important if we consider the reputation of the other things. Those other things might rise higher because not all compliance issues are equal either. So, just because there's a regulation or a law, which one's more important to enforce in some cases? As a speeding, think of it this way. If I'm a highway patrol and I'm following, and I see two cars, one speeding really fast but they're driving straight, see another car driving kind of slow but they're kind of going between the lanes a little bit, well, what's the risk? Which one's going to be more important for me to go after? I can't go after both. Well, most likely that's a drunk driver, and that's a bigger risk to the public, potentially, than the person that's speeding. Now, of course, if I'm CHP, I'm going to call someone else to get the other guy. But that's the idea, is that we can't do all those things, and that's why it's important to have that risk registry or the risk matrix and heat map to take a look at that. And then the probability is the last comment that on there. impacts could be part of the evaluation. But there's a probability, there's either a history of events that we can say, we know this has happened in the past, which means it's going to rise to the top. But there's also the black swan events, which are those things that we kind of haven't thought of, and oh my gosh, BP, Deepwater Horizons might consider black swan. You can kind of think about those events that might be part of that the unplanned that we weren't aware of. So I'm going to see. So on the categories of risk identification and analysis techniques, so we're moving actually quite well through here. We've got about 45 minutes left. So some of the things to talk about of how do we identify. So we've kind of talked in the broader context at this point of what's important. Now we're going to do a little deeper dive into how do we actually identify and analyze some of the techniques. And again, these were really a review of what was covered in ARM 54 as part of that. And so the things we'll talk about are, questionnaires and checklists, workshops, cause and effect analysis, failure analysis, the future states analysis. We'll go over briefly, and that's more like almost like Monte Carlo simulations. It's kind of doing what ifs. It's or tabletop exercises. So if you think of doing an emergency management exercise and kind of say, okay, this is what's the potential if this happened. How would we be prepared for those type of things? And that's really what the future states analysis is that talks about there. And the strategy analysis is, they use another term, it's SWOT. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And again, we'll talk about each of those. So on the different tools, when we think about them, checklists. Here, the positive, negatives. It kind of talks about this, and again, a review on this. When we think about a checklist of risks, and it's almost like an inspection check. They're pretty easy to use by anyone. It doesn't require a lot of thought. We say yes, we do this. No, we don't. So almost anyone can do it. The problem is that people just only look at the checklist and don't think outside the box of what else could go wrong, because then they're almost limited by what's on that checklist as part of that. On interviews and workshops, this kind of goes into Delphi analysis. We'll talk a little bit about that. But those are helpful. It's almost like focus groups to get those, but it's time intensive. Getting people arranged to be able to do those sometimes can be difficult, but it's usually good information. Escalation and threshold triggers. And this is more of when a certain threshold might be met that, when, let's say, I'm thinking about this more of a financial term, that a stock reaches a certain, price or, price point, you want to have a trigger to say, hey, we need to do something as part of the event that you're going to take a look at. Process flow analysis. Again, you might want to think of, okay, from a fleet standpoint, the input output, how does one thing work? It's just a flow chart. You kind of look at, okay, step one, and what could go wrong in those different steps to the time you produce the widget to the time that the widget goes into the store. Okay, what aspects, if we have a fire, or Highway 50 has a slide and we have to take our products up to Lake Tahoe, what effect does that have? Well, we're okay, we can go to Highway 80 and we'll be fine, but what if both have areas, and how do we get the product to market? Those are the type of things that, from a challenge, that fleet organizations have to think of all the time with that. And then also they have to consider the increased cost that it might have in doing so. Audits, which most people are familiar with, kind of like inspections. There's computer software, risk assessment tools. We have a lot of those developed that we've utilized within UC. And then there's also the team approaches. And again, we'll talk more about each one of these as we kind of go through. So this is actually in the book. As I mentioned, things you want to memorize, this is one you want to memorize. Because typically when the questions you're going to most likely see on the exam, it would be something like, of these techniques, which one involves, brainstorming, or looks at, so it might say, which one involves hazard and operability studies. And then you'll have all the things on the left-hand side that's potential answers, failure analysis, cause and effect analysis. You're going to need to know kind of which one goes into which bucket. But that's the type of question from a context that you'll probably see something like that on the exam. So we kind of talked a little bit about questionnaires, checklists, workshops, brainstorming, Delphi. cause and effect analysis, the 5 whys. And the idea, if you've never heard of the 5 whys, it's when an accident occurs, yes, why 5 times? Well, why, so someone slips and falls. Why did they fall? Well, because they slipped on water. Well, why was the water there? Well, because, someone was walking with a cup of ice or a cup of water, and they ended up doing, and they spilled it. Well, why did the person spill it? Well, because the cup didn't have a lid on it. Well, why didn't the cup? Well, because they're out of lids at the whatever. So you can kind of go through, and you say, okay, so what's, and it kind of gets to the root cause. The idea is at some point there was some failure that if it had a lid, it wouldn't have spilled, or because we didn't have enough stock, or the person didn't order, or it was not, those type of things. You can kind of, I mean, that's a simple example as part of what you want to do there. And though, most of this was kind of covered again, and the other one in a little more detail, but this just gives an overview of where we want to go with it. But this, again, Monte Carlo, you kind of see all the answers that we kind of talked about, but this is a nice snapshot. If there's one piece of information at a 50,000 foot level, it makes it easy to understand. Herb? Oh, okay.
You got access to water here.
I know. I was thinking the same thing. I don't know if there's.
Do you have control heaters?
Yeah. So unfortunately, so for those that are in person, we might actually. For those people online and will listen to the recording, it's a little warm in the conference room, right? So anyway, so now on to the next area. That again, this is a slide we used from before, but when we think about the holistic approach to risk identification, and why, when we do the risk assessment process, it's easy to go and say, okay, we're going to do the risk assessment, and I'm the person that's going to do it, but it doesn't really do any good unless you involve other people and other departments in what they do. So the goal, when we think from an enterprise level, is we want to break down the silos in the process. We want to get more departments involved. So we may want to get, if we're going to looking to start a new venture, we want legal involved, we want procurement, we want all these different aspects involved in that decision. We just don't want to make that decision in a vacuum. And when we think about the areas that we want to look at, when we do that evaluation, we need to be thinking of strategic, financial, and operational hazard risk. Too often we just think of just that one quadrant of risk, and we make that decision again in the silo. Well, people with different viewpoints can, with different operational backgrounds can say, they'll bring a different context that you probably never even thought of before. Or may not know that laws existed saying, well, no, you really can't do that. Before you go down this route, you may want to consider X, Y, Z. And there's a lot of examples that I know many people can think of. They can say, yeah, we went down this route and it completely failed because of this. We didn't think of this, or it cost way more money because of those type of aspects on there. And then the methods of identification, again, the top-down approaches and cascading hierarchy are part of the process. Again, when we think of the holistic risk identification, this is a good example. It takes out some of the specifics that talks about personnel, but the idea is we want to look at, from operational risk, operational risk identification, strategic risk identification, and it's, we want to involve, again, breaking down the silos is really what we're trying to do moving forward on this. The team approaches to risk identification, again, more review here, but facilitated workshops. A lot of times typically used for specific projects or purposes and can be used to identify some overall risks. And in some ways, that might be, from a space consideration with a non-office building. One of the things that we've gone through, they actually did facilitated workshops that they ask, questionnaires. How do you use the space that you're in? How can we optimize the space we have so that we're not, wasting, valuable office space, and we want to leverage it to the maximum. And so for those at Office of the President, we've seen that. And then also I was involved with facilitated workshops where they kind of ask more input to get clarification on some of those things. And that might be part of the process there. The Delphi technique, for those who aren't familiar with the Delphi technique, really involves 2 rounds of queries to selected experts individually. So they're not part of a group. You don't want to get groupthink. So a lot of times it'll be a questionnaire, again, asked individually. We'll combine the results, identify combine the results, and then share those results and see after that, do people, what's their opinion, again, individually with the new information, the new context of of having that new information. Do people change what their opinions are? And this is usually a way to get a lot of input from different people, but without having, it's not a huge cost to be able to do that. So it's kind of more of a survey software sometimes to be able to do some of that. Scenario analysis identifies various risks in projects, the potential consequences, and it's really the what-if analysis. Kind of similar to Monte Carlo to a certain extent. You want to kind of go through and you just start thinking, okay, what could go wrong with the project? Well, for those in the San Francisco Bay Area, what could go wrong with building the Bay Bridge? What are the consequences of outsourcing some of these different things? What are the consequences? I mean, that's a really good example when you think of a huge, huge project. And a lot of times, actually, most, I would say, construction firms, they actually go through that of how do we make sure, because every day that they're not building is loss of revenue for an organization. And so when you think about the same thing, now we have a bridge to nowhere. And could some of those things been solved by, okay, making sure you have audits in place? You think of what's the risk of, I think a huge risk, if you think of it, if the concrete mixture isn't properly done on a large project in which cars are going to be, I mean, you think of a huge risk to we're not having failure, especially when earthquake is the main reason it was built. You'd want to make sure that there's processes in place to make sure that constant checks on the mixture would be a key component of that. Now, they supposedly did it. Now there's a bad apple, but that goes in checks and balances of controls. What type of internal controls do you have? But again, when you think about it, that's not a hazard risk so much as it's an operational risk. Could you buy insurance? Well, no. Well, maybe, but it's not really going to cover the building of a new bridge. But the consequences of that have huge repercussions. And so when you think of it from that standpoint, you get more people involved. You might be able to think through these. Now, of course, this is 20/20 hindsight, but those are some of the considerations when you think. Hopefully, people will learn from the future what kind of controls do we have in place to make sure that those things don't happen. Now, they did the audit, but the audit was way after the fact, unfortunately. And again, when you look at that, you'll involve cross-functional teams to analyze risk from different perspectives. And so that's where, if you had audit and compliance in there, they'd say, well, how do you know the person that's doing the checks is doing them properly? Do they have certifications? I mean, that's where you get the different perspective of just having not just all these engineers saying, yeah, we're going to do the checks. Some other people go, well, how do you know? And that's what people are good at, is they'll bring their different talents in there. And auditors are really good at bringing those type of questions into that. HAZOP, which stands for Hazard and Operability Study. It's a complete review of a process or a system. And usually it's involved, in complex systems, nuclear, an aircraft. What could go wrong if this happens? And so that's really, they use hazard operability to look at the different components. What could go wrong with those various aspects? SWOT, I think most people are familiar with SWOT analysis, strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threats. And again, it's more of a team approach. And it could be a project or a product itself. And again, you get different aspects there. They do provide a table in the book that talks a little bit more about that. So in this chapter, at least the areas that I would focus on is more of the different techniques, when they would be used. It's more of what type of information you're going to get out of these. Do you need to know specific steps, 1, 2, 3, of hazard operability, of all these things? No, you just need to know what it is and how it's different from, a what if, or how is it different from a SWOT analysis, and where would it be good, based upon the type of people that might be involved in. Okay. So now we're moving on to risk treatment. Good time here. So after we do the risk analysis, or as part of the risk assessment, so we'll kind of step back. So the risk assessment, kind of the big piece, which involves identification and analysis, right? So we have those two components. So after we've done that, now we say, okay, now we're going to treat it. What are we going to do with this? We have this information, and how are we going to fix this problem? And so when we talk about risk treatment techniques, used for those in safety, traditionally we call them risk control techniques. So risk treatment is more, it's kind of the new term, and the idea is we're going to treat the risk. What are we going to do to mitigate it, to hopefully correct it, to a condition that is within our risk tolerance, that we feel that is an acceptable amount of risk or residual risk that we want to take on. So The different techniques, and again, we'll go through all these here, but we can avoid the risk, just not do it. That's one way. Again, with risk comes reward, so if you don't do it, with the bigger the risk, usually the bigger the reward. But so you have to keep that in mind of what things you want to do. But avoiding the risk is an option that might be looked at. You can modify the likelihood and or impact of the risk. And so that's when we talk about more risk control, which might involve loss prevention or loss reduction. We can transfer the risk. Well, transferring the risk is another word of buying insurance. Or we can transfer the risk by contractually doing that through indemnification language. We can say through a contract that, if something happens, you're going to hold us harmless. Okay, with youth activities. Everyone signs waivers. They don't even look at them. They sign these waivers saying, in the bounce house, I'm not going to sue you if my kid gets hurt. That's a transfer of risk, essentially. There's no insurance involved, but by just signing that, in many ways, you've waived your ability to, you still file a lawsuit, but they'll bring it up and say, okay, you're going to throw it out. You can retain the risk, which basically means you're going to self-insure to a certain extent, or you look at it, you say, okay, if something happens, I'm willing to pay the costs associated with that. Or in some cases, you can exploit the risk. And what that means is you're going to, that's what we consider the upside of risk. There might be something to where it's a positive aspect that we might be able to capitalize on the situation for a profit, private company to make a profit, or to be more efficient in our operations. But the reality is risk control with risk transfer and risk retention is the most common. So usually what's going to happen is there's always going to be some amount of insurance, excess insurance or something like that, just in case something goes wrong, we're going to have that. And we're going to probably retain a little bit. When we talk about retaining, just for those that are new to this area, that means it's a deductible. Lack of a better term, it's a deductible. We're saying, okay, and deductible can be $500, or in some cases, universities, we have a $5 million self-insured retention on some lines of coverage, meaning that we're retaining, it's not going to get worse than that much on it. And if it does go above that, then our insurance would then kick in at that point. And then part of that we're going to transfer, but then we're going to try to put some efforts in of putting mitigation. We're going to buy ergonomic equipment. We're going to use more sustainable products or less caustic products when people use things like that. Might be part of that discussion. So when we talk about what risk treatment we're going to do, what the process is, it involves making decisions based on the outcome of the risk identification analysis. So we're going to take that information. That's the beginning part. But the goal of risk treatment is to modify whatever the risk we identify and to assist the organization in meeting objectives. So if we identify a risk of injuries to employees, well, we're going to put in place some things in place to make sure that we can hopefully prevent those injuries from occurring. Because if we don't have employees doing the work, we can't achieve our mission. If we're spending all of our money on claims, that means less money towards education, research, and public service in the university setting. So that's the idea of how do we put that in context and put those techniques into play to do that. And it's a really continuous process. We're never done treating risk. We're always looking at, did we do it? Okay, but there's still a little bit more we can do. Again, with a large amount of employees, we have a lot of injuries that occur. Every organization probably has some injuries, and it's a never-ending process. You're never going to be done reducing or mitigating the risk that you might have. But the idea is, and the word they use, to a tolerable level of residual risk is what's used in the textbook. The idea is you're never going to eliminate risk, but if you want to consider what a tolerable level is, can you sleep at night? This might be one aspect. Do you feel, or another way of tolerable risk that I use with people, would you let your son, daughter work? Would you let your son, daughter do this, this whatever type of work, be involved with it, those type of things? And if the answer is no, then probably it's exceeded your tolerable risk and you need to do more work on that. But that's usually the kind of the idea that I give people of what an acceptable or tolerable level of risk might be in there. So it does give a definition of residual risk, the risk remaining after actions to alter risk likelihood or impact. So I give the example of fire sprinklers. Okay, if you consider that your residual risk, if you were to have a fire, obviously the fire sprinklers don't prevent a fire from occurring. They just extinguish it and hopefully reduce the amount of loss that you'll have. And so the idea is that, okay, once you understand that, okay, you have these the sprinklers based upon your operations, that the residual risk now, it can be new risk put into place, is, hey, you put out the fire, but now you have all this water damage that you have to deal with. So your residual risk is this new area. So that might be, well, if you put a more expensive type of system in that's more of a dry system or something else that's not water-based, or depending, well, maybe you can reduce it, but it's going to cost you more money to do that. So that's kind of the idea that you look at when you look at different types of systems to put in place. Or if you think, okay, if you buy a certain type of car, certain cars are going to be better from an accident standpoint. Well, they're going to be more expensive. But we know what's interesting is when you think about when car advertising, what do they sell? Besides fuel economy, they sell safety. They sell that this is a safe car. So, those are the things, and because that's what people think, and when people buy cars, that's what they do think about. Do they want to put their kid in that car? Is it going to be safe for them to do that? So on the risk treatment process, again, we kind of talked about, or I mentioned earlier, that risk treatments, they're not mutually exclusive. You're really going to do a combination of techniques. You're going to probably, usually if you avoid it, you're done, usually once you avoid the risk. But typically, you're going to be doing different aspects. And you might indicate, risk priorities of the chosen techniques of what you want to implement. So the first step is you're going to do, we might buy insurance as the first step, okay, because we don't have enough control of the risk. So we want to make sure we protect ourselves. And then we're going to start doing some other things, mitigating. And once we get better at, reducing slip falls, let's say, okay, we buy shoes, better slip resistant shoes, things like that. Now all of a sudden, we're doing a better job. Now, we can reduce our deductible. We can do some things. Maybe now we decide to retain the risk because we're doing a better job. It's more acceptable to us. So the idea is that, over time, things may change when you look at how you're going to treat a certain area. Monitoring is required, talks about as well, under-controlling and over-controlling the types of risks that you may see out there. Because at some point, you've been doing the same thing over for years, or what typically happens in most organizations, smaller organizations, is they buy insurance, and they've always had the same insurance coverage year after year after year. Well, the world has changed during that time, and yet they have the same type, and do they really need that coverage? Have they done a better job because of the risk control, or has new emerging risks came out that they're not aware of, things like that. So they have to take a look at, whether the insurance coverage, is it appropriate now? And I would say for most organizations, that's probably the one area. It's more in terms of transferring risk or buying insurance, they may be over-controlling areas that they don't need to at some point. And again, the techniques apply to all types of hazard, risk, hazard, operational, financial, strategic, because there'll be different applications of how we use them. But really, we want to talk about risk treatments. There's a treatment really that can be used for almost anything. And we talked earlier about speculative versus pure. But speculative, it's a chance of loss, no loss or gain, whereas a pure risk is it's either going to happen or it's not going to happen. But there's really no chance to optimize on that type of situation. In the book, they do show kind of the different areas of what we can do, as we talked about. Avoid the risk, modify the likelihood and impact of the risk. We can transfer, retain, or exploit the risk. So we're going to focus really on the middle one, which is loss prevention and loss reduction. So people sometimes get confused about what the difference is between the two. So loss prevention, and this is probably, okay, question, this will probably be the one, we'll put something on there as part of this, is what's the difference, which one is which. But so loss prevention is a risk control technique that reduces the frequency of a particular loss. Okay, so that means the event doesn't happen at all, or reduces the possibility. And then a loss reduction is a risk control technique that reduces the severity of a particular loss. So what would you put fire sprinklers in? What category?
Loss reduction.
Loss reduction, because the event still happened, doesn't change the frequency of the event, but it changes the severity of the event. Whereas, okay, providing slip-resistant shoes is going to be more of a loss prevention technique, because hopefully it's going to reduce the actual frequency of people actually slipping and falling. The kind of key thing here is that what you might hear within insurance terms, or people talk about frequency breeds severity. The idea is, what that means is, if you don't have any losses, you don't have any severity. Okay, so you know, from a frequency standpoint, a slip and fall can result in a sprained ankle, broken hip. Depends on how a person falls. The only way you can prevent that from occurring is by basically not having the fall in the first place. And that's why I mean by frequency breeds severity, is that if at all possible, you want to focus on preventing the frequency. So loss prevention is really the key there. But in some cases where you can't do it, then you want to focus on how can we reduce the impact of that loss from happening after the fact. So that's where we kind of look at those two situations. And so there'll probably be, usually there's a, remember, you know, from past exams, there's usually a question on something like that about frequency severity or loss prevention reduction, which one does which, or more, again, conceptually, they'll ask a question and say, a fire sprinkler system does this. Would this be considered a type of thing? It's not, that's why I remind people, when they do the test, you're not going to see questions that are looking for definitions a lot of times. They're going to be providing context and examples and say, okay, use your knowledge based upon this. What do you think it is using this situation? So, and that's where I think people have challenges on the exam. It's not just asking you to regurgitate information. They really want you to think about, do you understand the concepts that are in the textbook? So next one, risk is retention, which is a risk financing technique that involves assumption of risk in which gains and losses are retained within the organization. So essentially that means self-insuring, that we're going to retain a certain amount of risk that we're saying, and so anytime we have a claim, we're going to pay out the claim. The reason why we'd want to do that instead of buy insurance is that if we have, you know, when you buy insurance, you're paying money out. If you don't have any losses, you're not saving any money. The insurance is going to get, you know, think about when you buy, you know, car insurance. You can have no losses for 10 years. Now, technically, I don't know if you know this, but you can, in the state of California, you can actually self-insure for auto insurance if you want to. You have to put security deposits and do all that. Most people wouldn't want to do that. Most large companies do. They self-insure for auto because it makes sense based upon the large fleet. Law of large numbers, they'll be able to do that. But individually, it doesn't make sense to do that. But you could. And the idea is, hey, if you haven't had an accident in 10 years, the $1,000 a year you pay, that's $10,000. So you can say, look, we saved this much money if you retain it. The problem is one large loss, one accident, will probably eat all that up away. But when you're dealing with a large organization, you know, and you look at, you know, the number of vehicles, again, you can determine your frequency and how much money you should retain, because then you'll be able to pay for, because you'll pay for those losses one way or the other. And that's what they do here. So risk financing. Again, this is, you know, is a conscientious act or decision not to act that generates the funds to offset the variability in cash flows that may occur as an outcome of risk. So basically, when we talk about risk financing, there's two ways we can do it. We can buy insurance as part of it, or we can actually retain. And the idea is that we are still, either way, you're setting aside money to pay for something that you expect is probably going to happen. Okay, and so all those nice words that they use in the text, you know, the variability of cash flows, essentially you need to set aside money to pay for that, whether it's a funded reserve or you just have to acknowledge that you're going to have money for that. Whereas transfer, more specifically, is buying insurance. It's a risk financing technique by which the financial responsibility for losses and variability in cash flows is shifted to another party. So when we talk about, we talk about insurance, but it is transferring the risk. Essentially, Allstate is saying, we're saying, look, we're going to give you $1,000, and they're going to take the risk now. So we're transferring the risk to them. And they say, you know, we think you're a good driver based upon your history and all that. We'll take your premium, and if something does go wrong, we have 100,000 other drivers to help pay for your one individual claim. And they have actuarial tables to determine how many people they need to cover, what rates they need to do to make money, to be profitable in doing that. And actually, auto insurance is probably one of the most predictable areas of insurance, as well as life insurance. I think is pretty predictable too. So we talked about, you know, transfer, risk financing, and this is just more of a graphical depiction of where this goes. Now, risk financing is ARM 55, and that'll be more detail about that, so we're not going to talk too much more about it. So now we're going to go into accident analysis techniques, and this is probably more my bread and butter area that I actually enjoy talking about. And I'll probably send out a link to a video. I'll see if I can get it set up that talks more about the technique of operations review. But there are 5 theories that we're going to talk about in the textbook that are listed here. And the thing I would keep in mind, it's not as important that you know the specific details, in order, because the energy transfer theory, there's a lot of information in there on some of these things. But there'll probably be a question describing this type of technique, and then you're going to have to pick which one it is from the list that's on here. But you got to be able to know what are some of the aspects or attributes of which type of techniques would be used when you look at accident causation. In general, what again they provide in the book is that some of the basic causes when you look at accident causation, and this could also be people, public, general liability, auto accidents, workers' comp, whatever. The accident causation theory is pretty much the same. That you may have a management safety policy or some decisions are made. There'll be some personal factors that lead to it. That personal factors might be, trying to think, I'm not, maybe I wear glasses. There might be some other type of things, or I might be, trying to think of the right terms here. Type of shoes I'm wearing, for flip-flops versus shoes, regular shoes. That could be some of the personal those type of things. And then you have some would be kind of environmental too. But then the environmental factors are, that is okay. Are you walking on grass? You're walking on cement? I mean, those are the type of things that could that help contribute to what might be happening. Ice, or environmental factors. If you're driving on a sunny day on the road versus heavy wind and snow or something like that, those are environmental factors that will have an impact on a causation possibly. The indirect causes are some of the symptoms. The unsafe act and then unsafe condition. We'll talk a little bit more about that with Heinrich's theory. But the idea is someone didn't follow a safety procedure, or someone was unsafe act, is talking on a cell phone, or they're texting while driving. That's the unsafe act. The unsafe condition that's traditionally, that's more of a physical condition when people think about it. That's if I was walking and there's a lip on the cement, and that might be the unsafe condition. And the other unsafe act was I was texting because I wasn't looking at where I was walking, which may lead to the likelihood that I'll trip and fall. And then the direct causes are going to be the unplanned release of energy or the hazardous material. And again, the kind of unplanned release is more the energy release theory, but I'll kind of go through that here. And then again, you have the accident. I think that's part of it.
Are basic causes, are those synonymous with root causes?
I'd probably say no in this case. I don't think they go. No, because they don't go far enough. At least as far as this. So I would say there's really one other beyond that. Because I would say it's more systems. There's some systems issue that might be part of it. So if we go through the domino theory, which is Heinrich. So one of the things about Heinrich, and I think it mentioned, and there's some ideas that Heinrich's theory is they used to show the pyramid, and the idea is that about 98% or 85% of all accidents are caused by unsafe acts, and the other and here we put it 98% are caused by unsafe acts. The other area was, well, it's unsafe conditions or other things that may cause people to get injured. And the idea being it's people. That's what people are doing that causes an accident. It's not the material that they're working with or the physical conditions. It's them not paying attention that's really leads to most of it. Now, and then the other part of this, it's kind of more background is under Heinrich's theory, you might have 300 near misses, and then out of those you might have 30 claims that would be, or situations where they were minor injuries, and then you'll have of that probably 5 that would have led, of a certain condition that lead to a major injury, and then out of that you'll have 1 fatality. So the idea, the idea of this pyramid structure is that if you can control, what people do, the frequency of these events, you're going to reduce the likelihood of having major accidents, and so that's where Heinrich's theories kind of come into play. Now the 5 factors that kind of show the result of the chain of 5 factors that are in here, and I'm going to, the first one is ancestry and social environment, the fault of the person. 3 is the unsafe act or mechanism, and then 4 is the act in itself, and 5 is the resulting injury. And so these are kind of like the dominoes. And the idea is if you remove one domino out of here, you reduce, you're not going to have the resulting injury. So if you remove any of the 4 dominoes prior to that, you're not going to have the factor. And so it kind of talks about more detail in here of what these, ancestry includes inherited psychological disorders. It can be dysfunctional social environment, can form unsafe character traits, may impede learning. Both ancestry and social environment can cause faults of person. The faults of person can include impulsiveness, violent temper, nervousness, resistance to accept safe practices, all of which can cause unsafe acts to occur. Or faults of person, another term they use here, complacency. I think we require that. The unsafe acts can include improper use of machine or equipment, ignoring lockout, tagout, safe operating procedures, and the mechanical side or physical hazard, the slippery floors, inadequate ventilation, the accident occurrence that causes an injury, and then the injury illness is the trauma to the body caused by the accident. So these are the kind of the ideas that are behind there. But the idea is that every accident begins with number 1 and ends with an injury. Removing any of the 4 preceding injury events prevents that injury. But really the most emphasis is always going to be placed on the 3rd step, which if you look on there, is unsafe acts or unsafe conditions. If we can control that under Heinrich's theories, that's where it's going to get us the biggest bang for our buck. Well suited to accidental losses, again, from human activity. So the idea is that, so that's the idea of when would you use this one? It's more for human activity, and you're going to see from Hayden's and the others it kind of may not apply as much on there. And we go to energy release theory. According to Hayden, accidents result from uncontrollable energy releasing on structures that can't withstand the energy in certain rates or amounts, and the focus is on controlling released energy, reducing the harm caused by that energy. Okay, so when they talk about energy, we think of, okay, electrical a lot of times. We think of those type of things. But when you want to think, a lot of times we're talking about kinetic energy. So the idea is if someone falls, okay, there's a force there. Whether it's a pressurized system, this also, for those that are familiar with lockout, tagout, the idea is if you have electrical, you lock out a piece of equipment, you turn off the circuit breaker. Now you've reduced the idea, there's no energy flow that's going to come, so therefore you're not going to have that. If you're on the roof, if you wear a harness, a fall protection harness, now you're going to reduce the energy that's going to be part of it. So it talks a lot about those things. So it talks about the 10 basic strategies in the book. Prevent the marshalling of energy, reduce the amount of energy marshal, prevent the release of built-up energy. That's all lockout, tagout for the most part. Kind of addresses those areas. And it kind of goes, modify the rate or spatial distribution of release of energy, separating space and time. And so it kind of has these things. You're going to go, what the heck does all this really mean? Strengthen susceptible structure. But Emily, our office, actually included in here. It's not on the slides that were sent out, but I'll modify on the upload here. So Emily found a site that kind of talked a little bit more, some different strategies of what, to kind of follow that energy release theory in there. And, so how to reduce the amount of hazard created, and this kind of some different ideas. Reduce the height of a diving board above the swimming pool, prevent the release of a hazard that already exists, put safety devices on electrical outlets. So the idea of, okay, GFCI, ground fault, circuit interrupt. So the idea is, okay, in outside areas where the potential for water, you can get shocked, okay, that can help reduce the potential. So we're not doing lockout, tagout, but we have other devices that will do some of those things. So I would say Hayden really is more, not so much about people, where if you think of Heinrich, that's about people, what they do, it's unsafe conditions, really focusing on that. Hayden's really focusing on equipment. It's focusing on the materials that are being used. So that's kind of the key concept you want to get out of Hayden is, how do you, it's really modifying, looking at the potential for energy releases or, again, car crashes. How do you prevent that? You have better bumpers or release. Okay, again, all these things talks about energy release. We can't necessarily dissipate the energy. It talks about creating interspatial space. What's an airbag? Okay? That's the idea. That's the whole concept of Hayden in action, is how do you prevent those type of situations from occurring. Techniques of operations review. This is actually, I probably subscribe to Peterson, and this is the video I'm going to try to see if I can't send out. It's an older one, but it gives you a good it's a good background, I think, that will make it more understandable. But the idea is root cause of accidents can be management failures or shortcomings such as improper policies or procedures, supervision, or training. So the idea, kind of going back to the more the root cause beyond that, is that in many ways, what I kind of always say, when an accident happens to an employee, I blame the manager. Because typically, if people weren't wearing eye protection, well, it's because usually that wasn't the first time. It's the manager or whatever, thought, didn't say anything. So there was basically, that's a management failure in not acting to say correct those conditions. A lot of times people know that there's hazards, or if there was no policy on not wearing it, okay, well there should have been, because we recognize that there's potential for people getting injured in those cases. So again, that's the one key aspect. The key to effective line safety performance is having management specify procedures for accountability. So, and then removing management's faults such as inadequate coaching, failure to take responsibility, unclear authority, workplace disorder, inadequate planning or organizing, and personal deficiencies will eliminate most, if not all, accidents. So the idea is that if people, simple term, accountability. So if people are held accountable and management's held accountable for making sure safe operations and they enforce the rules, and when they see people doing things wrong, that's the idea, is that when you take those last things out, the faults of inadequate coaching, you're more likely to actually reduce that. Because if you think about it, and really the techniques of operations review, if you think about it, it's the idea is you manage safety like you manage everything else. And that's one of the videos of what you get is that he talks about, if you discipline someone for showing up late to work, and you do that, why aren't you doing the same thing for someone that doesn't follow safety rules? But people think that they're two different things, and what Peterson really tries to emphasize is, hey, if you just manage it just like you do everything else, you're going to get the same results. You're going to eliminate people being tardy or customer service issues or inventory problems. But people think safety is a totally separate thing, although that's safety. So anyways, I'm getting off my soapbox now. But that's one of the things I subscribe to, and I think most people recognize that is, just like with risk management is really nothing more than good management in many cases when you think about it. So this is also from the book, The View of Root Causes of Accidents, by Pearson, to establish 5 basic principles of risk control. An unsafe act or unsafe condition and an accident are all symptoms of something wrong in the management system. Certain circumstances, unless identified and controlled, will produce severe injuries. Safety should be managed like any other organizational function, with management setting achievable goals and planning, organizing, leading, controlling to achieve them. Again, just like you control for widgets or quality control, they'll put all those factors in. You need to do the same thing with that. Management must specify procedures for accountability, and then the function of safety is to locate and define the operational errors that allow accidents to occur. But again, if you think about, okay, the first, kind of going back, quick review. Heinrich, it's about people, unsafe conditions, that's the focus. Hayden is about more of equipment, materials, those type of things. Technique, operations or TOR is all about management. It's about management oversight. So that's kind of how you might want to think about when you study. And that will give you, again, that's a 50,000-foot level, easy way to memorize who's doing what and what's important. The other 2 theories that are talked about are change analysis. In change analysis, it projects the effects of a given system change is likely to have on an existing system. Some people call it change management aspect. There's or management of change policy. I don't know if people have ever heard of that term, but a lot of times, some organizations on process safety management, they actually have a change of management policy or management of change policy. The idea is if they replace a certain part with a different type of part, what's the potential impact? Or if they do something different with the system, if I'm going to use a different type of material for construction, and it says what if? It's doing scenario analysis. That's really what change management analysis is. And so that people are aware of the different conditions and what could possibly go wrong, and they thought about those in advance. Job safety analysis, analysis that dissects a repetitive task performed by a person or machine to determine potential hazards. It's really more used in manufacturing or certain areas where production line, they say, okay, this person's going to be doing this type of job. What are the potential hazards? Okay, they're going to do step 1. When they lift up the material, how do they need to do? Okay, well, this is, they can cut themselves, so we need to make sure they have gloves, or they need to do this, or there's a pinching hazard when they put it in here. It's looking at each and every step that the person's going to do. If you think about a production line, you can pretty much, it's real easy. The problem is job safety analysis doesn't work really well and you have people out in the field just doing everything, facilities maintenance, okay? So, okay, the challenge, you'd have, but the idea is at some point, well, maybe there's specific activities where there's more types of injuries occurring. You may want to do a job safety analysis for those specific tasks, saying, okay, why are we having these injuries? What things could we buy this piece of equipment that can now eliminate this injury? And so that's where it can be effective, but it's usually a challenge. It's kind of difficult for a lot of organizations to do JSAs. System safety analysis. Getting up on, we're going to go just a little bit over. But in the book, it talks about system safety analysis, and I'd like to kind of broaden that to systems thinking. If you get a chance, actually I wouldn't read it, but I'd listen on books on tape, is Peter Senge's The Fifth Discipline. It's about systems theory, and that's really where systems safety comes into play. But looks at the organization as a whole to identify sources of potential losses. And the idea is that if you think of everything as a system, what's the interplay between different aspects of how we operate? If you think of a balloon, if I push here, then it's going to, we're going to have an exposure here. What you may do in one area may potentially, have a potential result in another. But for whatever reason, I remember this was always the question. This is the same information that was even in the old exam. They usually say, where did system safety come from, or something like that. And that's why I included this little de facto information of that was part of the Minuteman missile by the Department of Defense. They're the ones that really originated within to look at system safety. And the reason why is that you look at each component, what could go wrong, what are the different aspects you need to think about from a system. And from the design, manufacture, deployment, they really thought of what are the different steps that need to be considered. The definition, a safety engineering technique also used as an approach to accident causation that considers mutual effects of interrelated elements of a system on one another throughout the system's life cycle. So the idea when we talk, in the key word here is life cycle, is that if I buy this type of battery, okay, like cell phones, okay, the life cycle, or lithium batteries now. We have all these batteries. Well, what do we know about some of these things? They can, can't just throw them in the garbage, those type of things. There's hazardous materials that might be associated with them. So when we build something, we need to think of, okay, yeah, we're going to use it for all these things, but we also have to think of the life cycle at the end. What are we going to do with it when we're done using it? And so that's what the whole systems idea is about, is looking at that whole area. It can help estimate probability of failure events and also prevent future failures, looking at, okay, with this in an area that there's a more likelihood of something going wrong, but does not focus on unsafe acts or conditions, okay? So this is where it's a little different. It's really, again, looking at the context of what can go wrong, it's more probability, those type of things. Concept, I would know, you won't, again, most likely a question on something like this, the components of a system. In this case, components are the concept of systems, or what it includes. The four features are components, purpose, environment, and life cycle. Again, most likely this is one of those areas, for whatever reason, they end up having quite a few questions on system safety. At least that was my experience in the past. So we think of components. All systems are going to have physical elements. Any damage to the physical element of a system can shut down the entire system. So that can be machinery. There's going to be, or if it's a vehicle, something like that. Then the subsystems, there might be some subsystems as part of that. So if you have a vehicle, what can go wrong with the vehicle? You have brakes, you have an engine, you have all those things. So that's part of the area that you need to consider. You're also within their components, purpose. Every system has to at least one purpose. To assess the adequacy of systems components, risk management professionals must know the purpose of those components. What is it meant to do? What are we trying to achieve? The environment. Environments are typically aspects of larger systems. You can typically, as it talks about, classify the immediate physical environment. So it might be what the conditions we're operating in. What type are we operating on, the type of roads? Are we through, or we, that can be part of the environment we need to consider. The policies and procedures, the organizational environment. The legal environment we operate. We need to consider as part of our systems, okay, if we're California, a little more litigious than, if I talk to someone in Texas, they're not as litigious in Texas. The transportation laws, different regulations. We have to consider the environment in which we're going to operate that system. then we think of life cycle, and again, this is something that will most likely be on there, the phases of life cycle. So we have the concept in our mind, we want to build X, Y, Z. Then there's the engineering aspect. We need to draw the plans for it. We're going to say, okay, here's the components, here's the materials we want to have that are going to make up this thing. So we, we had this idea. Then we're actually make it. Okay, we're going to make this material. We're going to put it, produce it, and then we're going to actually operate it. And at some point, we're going to dispose of it. It's going to, go through its life cycle cost. So, concept. I'm a school district. I need to get students to the school. So we need to have it. So engineering, the engineering aspects might be, okay, we need this type of school bus. We need this quantity. Okay, it's going to be produced. We're going to have them. We're going to put it in operation. We're going to drive them all around. At some point, what are we going to do? At the end of the lifestyle, we're going to do them to surplus. What's the residual value? Is there any cost to us after the fact? So that kind of gives you an idea, just in vehicles, how we might think of that. And then this is kind of gives more detail. It's in the book, but the basic purpose, mission planning, that's conceptual phase. Engineering phase is the design of the system, construct and test it. Machine guards, fire detection systems, if you're thinking machinery, but it doesn't have to be machinery. It can be a process as well in some cases. Production phase, when it's actually created or purchased, so we bought the buses. Operational, it's implemented, safety features built into it, and the disposal, when we're going to get rid of it. I'm not going to actually do the case study for time purposes, but it's in the book. And it kind of talks about, if you think about, okay, system safety, the failure of brakes on delivery truck can be viewed within these systems. What effect does that have on the system? It's not just the failure of the brakes. The product doesn't get there. We can't, the driver, system that transport, the internet servers, the transportation system. We have to think of the context of the type of road. Do they, a good example, the buses that we have, the fleet for UCSF that have a fleet, okay, their buses have much more wear and tear going up and down those hills in San Francisco than they do over here on the East Bay, where it's flatter. So the maintenance required, that has to be part of the system's thinking of, the cost that might be part of that. And then it kind of goes through some of these different areas, the advantages and disadvantages of those areas. Last couple things, and before we end for tonight, are some of the different types of hazard risks we talked about in the risk control techniques. We talked a little bit about them, but we're going to just go just a little bit more detail. But when we talk about loss control techniques, they include avoidance, loss prevention, loss reduction, separation, duplication, diversification. So when we talk about avoidance, I think it's a fairly easy concept. The only way we can reduce it to zero is really to avoid the loss. So loss is impossible as probability of loss is reduced to zero. No further risk control or risk financing measures needed because we're not doing it. But really, it doesn't use that often. Very limited application should be considered when the expected value of the loss from an activity outweighs the expected benefits. So usually we're not going to see avoidance used too often if it's part of what we do. Yeah. Loss prevention, any measure that reduces the probability or frequency of a particular loss. Loss prevention reduces frequency without necessarily affecting the severity of the loss. It does not eliminate all chances. But again, it's usually when we think about loss prevention, if we can break that chain, the domino theory, the unsafe act, that's hopefully what we're trying to do, to do that. Loss reduction, any measure that reduces the severity of a loss. Again, we're focusing on now severity when we talk about reduction. It assumes that a loss has occurred and then asks what could have done to either before or after the loss to reduce the size or extent. So we're not saying we're not going to prevent it. We're going to try to reduce what the potential is. And then it talks about pre-loss measures. The idea is reduce severity, which we can reduce frequency. And the post-loss, this was something actually in the old book that they kind of talk more as post-loss event, of emergency procedures, salvage operations, the things we might want to consider after a loss occurred that we might help reduce losses. And again, it's loss reductions commonly used in energy release theory. So the idea is that when we think about reduction in losses, how can we reduce? Okay, if you think of energy release fire, a lot of there's energy produced. Well, how can you produce energy? You put a whole bunch of water on it. Okay, so that would be, again, energy release theory would be a loss reduction effort typically. We didn't eliminate the energy, we just reduced it from that. Separation of exposure units. So the idea is if you have a factory, you want the factories right next to each other, so you separate them. Or this is the idea is you have them in different states. So if one, or a different area, so if one factory burns down, they're separated enough, you still have your operation to continue. That's the idea. So it divides an organization's existing single asset of operation to two or more. You know, it's appropriate if organization can meet its goals with only a portion of these separate units left intact. The challenge is it's expensive to have separate units if you don't need to. Duplication reproduces the organization's assets or activities to keeps it in reserve. So the idea is if you have a certain type of part that you need, you might have an extra, you know, spare part. A lot of times you'll do duplication on smaller pieces, but if you have a big piece of equipment that's really expensive, it may be cost prohibitive to have that unused. I mean, to have duplication, to have another piece that's not in production. Why would you want to, you know, have another one just sitting there idle if you don't need to use it? Again, neither separation or duplication attempts to reduce the severity of loss to a single unit. Both reduce the severity of an individual loss, but they could have different effects of loss frequency. So, you know, again, if you know one may have fire, you have to look at susceptibility based on whether you're using separation, duplication, but the idea is that if you duplicated something and you had it in the building and you had a fire, well, and there goes your duplication. It doesn't help you, so you need to keep that in mind. Duplication reduces the average expected annual loss from a given exposure because it reduces the severity without increasing the loss frequency. What that means is that if you had this piece go down because you had it, you know, the loss of money from production, you'll be able to get back up and running quicker, so it reduces the severity of the loss, but you know, without increasing loss frequency in some cases. And this is kind of this more detail than you probably need on this last part. The last one on diversification. If you just think about it, stocks. You know, when you talk about diversifying your portfolio, that's all this is do you want to do different things so you're not stuck if something happens. But the idea is that spreads loss exposures over numerous projects, products, markets, or regions, that you're going to expand outside just one area, because if you're only focused on one thing and things go south, okay, good example, I think, from diversification is Krispy Kreme, okay? Krispy Kreme, pretty much, they had tons of shops, but the idea is there's only so many donuts you can eat. The only thing they did was donuts, right? Okay, so how many times are you going to go out of your way to go get a Krispy Kreme donut? If you look at Dunkin' Donuts, on the other hand, what do? They're doing the other stuff, breakfast sandwiches. They're doing lunches. So they're open all the time, but they're not just doing. They learned they had to diversify to survive. But you know, but traditionally donut shops, you know, when you're doing a high-end type thing with spending a lot of money on huge corner lots, things like that, they couldn't expend the money. Then again, primarily deals with business risk. So went through everything. Took a little bit longer tonight. Any questions for folks before we end the webinar? Looks like. So hopefully everyone enjoyed the first class. A lot of information. And so if you haven't read some of that, you know, again, as people do have questions, I encourage you to please go ahead and email me, call me. In between, I'm more than happy to do that. As well as prior to the next class, I try to have time where people can ask questions as well. So by all means, certainly do that. So thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.